The city swallows them. The initial German push into the city in September of 1942 was characterized by a confidence that would prove catastrophically misplaced. German commanders expected to take Stalingrad in a matter of days, perhaps a week. The Soviet forces defending it were outnumbered, outgunned, and had been battered by the preceding months of fighting. Intelligence assessments suggested that Soviet resistance was near its breaking point. Some German staff officers were already thinking about what came after Stalingrad: the push to the Caucasus, the oil fields, the endgame of the Eastern Campaign. What they did not fully understand was that they were about to enter a completely different kind of war. The Soviet general responsible for defending Stalingrad was Vasily Chuikov, a tough, profane, physically imposing man who had thought deeply about how to fight the Germans in this terrain. Chuikov understood that his forces could not match the Germans in open engagement. In the open field, German combined arms tactics, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power working together, were devastating. The answer was not to fight that battle. The answer was to deny the Germans the space they needed to fight it. Chuikov's strategy was radical and simple: get as close to the enemy as possible. So close that German artillery and air support become too dangerous to use for fear of hitting their own men. So close that the technological advantages of the Wehrmacht, the tanks, the coordination, the air power, become irrelevant. Reduce every engagement to its most primitive form: man against man, with a weapon in a room. He called it hugging the enemy. Others would later call it something darker. The battle that followed defies easy description. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was hundreds, then thousands, of simultaneous engagements in an area of a few square kilometers, every building, every staircase, every cellar contested. A factory floor became a front line, a water tower became a sniper's eyrie. A grain elevator became a fortress held for weeks by a handful of men. Time collapsed. Distances that seemed trivial on a map, the distance between two floors of the same building, the width of a street, the gap between two piles of rubble, became the distance between living and dying. Soldiers on both sides reported that after a few days in Stalingrad, their world shrank to the immediate. The next room, the next second, nothing else existed. The German military term for this kind of fighting was Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. They did not mean it as a compliment. It was an acknowledgement of disgust and disorientation. This was not the clean, decisive war of movement they had trained for and believed in. This was something subterranean, exhausting, and psychologically corrosive. The famous Pavlov's house stands as a symbol of what this fighting looked like in practice. A single apartment building near the city's center, defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, held for nearly 2 months against repeated German attempts to take it. The building became a fortified position, its walls reinforced, its windows turned into firing positions, mines laid around its perimeter. German forces suffered heavy casualties trying to capture it again and again. It did not fall. And while Pavlov's house is remembered because it has a name, there were dozens of similar positions across Stalingrad. Buildings defended to the last man. Cellars fought over until no one was sure who held them. Stairwells where the front line moved up and down by floor, sometimes changing hands in the course of a single hour. In this environment, individuals emerged whose personal stories became part of the battle's mythology, not because they were exceptional in their humanity, but because they were exceptional in their capacity for survival and adaptation. Vasily Zaitsev is the most famous of them. A young man from the Ural Mountains, Zaitsev had grown up hunting in the taiga, developing patience, precision, and an almost preternatural ability to remain motionless for hours. In Stalingrad, these skills translated into a different kind of hunting. As a Soviet sniper, Zaitsev operated across the rubble field of the city, picking off German officers and soldiers with a methodical precision that terrified the men he hunted. His confirmed kill count ran into the hundreds. But beyond the numbers, what Zaitsev represented was something the Soviet command understood instinctively: a story, a face, a name that could be printed in newspapers and put in front of soldiers who needed to believe that the individual mattered, that one person could make a difference in a battle that often felt like pure, anonymous slaughter. The Germans, for their part, understood the propaganda value of eliminating him and allegedly sent their own master sniper, the identity and details of whom remain disputed by historians, to hunt Zaitsev in turn. Whether the dramatic duel that followed was entirely as described in Soviet accounts remains debated. But the fact that such a story was told and believed tells us something important about what Stalingrad did to the people fighting it. In a battle of millions, the individual needed to matter, but for every story that has a name, there were 10,000 that don't. There were soldiers who fought for weeks without seeing the sky, who ate whatever could be found, sometimes nothing, who slept in 2-hour intervals, always with a weapon, always with the knowledge that the man who slept deepest was the man most likely to die, who learned to read the sounds of the city the way a sailor reads weather, the particular quality of gunfire that meant a German advance, the silence that preceded a Soviet counterattack, the specific whistle of the Katyusha rockets before they arrived. The Katyusha. The Germans called it the Stalin organ for the sound it made, a howling multi-toned shriek as the rockets launched in salvos. Both sides feared artillery, but the Katyusha acquired a particular reputation. It did not arrive surgically. It arrived as an event, a transformation of a section of ground from something solid into something temporarily composed of fire and fragment. To be in a building struck by a sustained artillery barrage is to understand the body's most primitive instincts. Every soldier who survived Stalingrad and left an account described the same thing: the helplessness of it. You could not fight the artillery. You could only press yourself into the smallest possible space and wait for it to stop and hope that when it stopped, you were still a person and not a body. The physical toll was immense. The psychological toll may have been greater. What the cold did to them, October arrived, and with it, the first signs of the Russian winter. The soldiers on both sides had been fighting for weeks by then. Many of the German troops had expected the campaign to be over by autumn. This was the optimistic schedule, the one that did not quite accommodate the reality of Stalingrad's resistance. Some had come without adequate winter clothing. Supplies were stretched across hundreds of kilometers of open steppe, vulnerable to Soviet raids, and simply to the enormous logistical challenge of moving material through that terrain. The cold came gradually at first, and then it didn't. By November, temperatures were dropping to minus 20, minus 25 degrees Celsius. By January, they would reach minus 30 and below. In such temperatures, machinery malfunctions, engine oil freezes, weapons jam, wounds that might heal in temperate conditions become infected, gangrenous, lethal for the men without adequate clothing, and many German soldiers found themselves in this position because the supply system had not anticipated a winter campaign of this duration. The cold became another enemy, an enemy that worked constantly, day and night, that could not be shot or outmaneuvered, that did not take breaks. Frostbite was endemic. Soldiers lost fingers, toes, ears. Men who had been fighters of exceptional capacity became slowly, physically diminished. Their coordination impaired, their thinking slowed, their bodies burning enormous caloric energy just to maintain consciousness in the cold, and the food to replace those calories was not arriving. The German supply lines to Stalingrad ran through territory that the Soviet Air Force increasingly contested. The further from the front, the more dangerous the roads became. Closer to the city, Soviet artillery made surface movement a gamble. Supplies arrived intermittently, in quantities that fell well short of what the men needed. On the Soviet side, conditions were not significantly better in terms of raw physical hardship. The Soviets had better winter equipment. The Russian military had learned from centuries of fighting in this climate, but they too suffered from the cold, from hunger, from exhaustion. The difference was that the Soviets had the Volga. The river crossing was nightmarish. German artillery had the river in range, and crossing it meant running a gauntlet under fire, often at night, in boats that were frequently sunk or damaged. Soldiers swam for their lives in water that was close to freezing. Supplies were lost. Reinforcements arrived soaked and half dead before they ever reached the front. When the river froze, it became marginally safer, but not much. Crossing the ice in daylight under German observation meant presenting yourself as a target on a flat white surface with nowhere to hide. And yet the crossing continued, night after night. The Soviet command understood that Stalingrad had to be supplied, had to be reinforced, or it would fall. The men who crossed the Volga in small boats under artillery fire were not heroes in any comfortable, abstract sense. They were men doing a terrible thing because they had been told to do it, and because the alternative was letting the city die. The psychological pressure on both sides was accumulating at a rate that human beings are genuinely not designed to withstand. Sleep deprivation, chronic malnutrition, constant exposure to death and dismemberment. These do things to the human mind that are difficult to describe without understating them. Soldiers reported hallucinations. They reported emotional numbness, an inability to feel anything about the deaths of the men around them, which they understood intellectually was a form of damage even as they experienced it as relief. They reported the disappearance of the future as a concept. In Stalingrad, there was no future. There was only this moment, this room, this second. Veterans would later describe something that researchers now recognize as dissociation, the sense that one's actions are happening at a distance from oneself, as if you are watching yourself fight from somewhere else. This is a protective mechanism, the mind creating space between the self and the intolerable. But it is also a wound, one that many men carried for the rest of their lives. Letters written during the battle, on both sides, from the German soldiers to their families and from Soviet soldiers to theirs, are extraordinary documents of this psychological state. Some are practical, some are desperate, some are unexpectedly tender, speaking of small details. A memory of summer, the face of a wife, the name of a child, with an intensity that comes from understanding that such things may never be experienced again. One German soldier wrote to his family, "I often ask myself whether there is a God. If there is, then all of this must be part of His plan, and I cannot understand it. But I think of you every day, and that is a prayer of its own." He did not survive,